And now it's going to be a great pleasure for me to introduce our next speaker. And I want to start by saying that if Juan Trippe was the father of commercial aviation, as has been rightfully said, then our next speaker is certainly the father of commercial aviation history. A prolific author at 22 books? 23? 22? I always have to check. In fact, we need a number. 23? Perhaps 23 books, and publisher under the Pallador imprint of many, many others. His works are completely indispensable, and never more than arm's length for me, I can tell you. I have the complete set on my desk at all times, and you will see our next speaker cited more often than perhaps any other author in our exhibition texts and publications. And of course, I'm talking about Ron Davies. Ron was born in England, where he began a civil service career in 1938. He spent World War II in the British Army and then joined the new Ministry of Aviation, moving on to British European Airways, then to Bristol, de Havilland, and Hawker Siddeley aircraft manufacturing companies. Ron developed several procedures for airline traffic forecasting and likely established the world's first air transport market research department. In 1968, he joined Douglas Aircraft Company in their marketing and economic research areas, specializing in Eastern Europe and China. In 1981, Ron was offered the Lindbergh Chair of Aerospace History at the National Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian Institution, where he became and continues to serve as Curator of Air Transport. I might also add that Ron is a Fellow of the San Francisco Aeronautical Society. Making his third appearance and delivering his fourth lecture here at SFO to present his talk, Pan American Airways, Conquest of the Pacific, it is a great joy to welcome back Ron Davies.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that magnificent introduction. We'll settle up later. I have to say that after sitting through today, this is several hard acts to follow. I haven't seen a lecture like Carol Nickersher's for a long, long time. And of course, a gentleman named Sikorsky, who's now not far behind. I was a bit disappointed. You know, I don't know whether you've heard about this, there's a saying in Britain, after the Lord Mayor's show. I don't know whether you've heard this phrase, it's sometimes quoted. It's to describe an anticlimax. And I feel a bit of an anti. And the phrase refers to the fact that when there's a huge procession in London with wonderful horse and carriages and pomp and circumstances and lots of horses and so on, and like the coronation or mainly things like that. What is not often remembered is that after all the wonderful coaches have passed by, after the Lord Mayor's show, there comes a cart armed with men with shovels. I'm also, I was a bit disappointed in John's introduction. He didn't describe my magnificent army career, which I joined up as a volunteer in 1939. Did 6.5 years, that counts double, active service. So I qualified for a long service medal and also a citation from the government, which unfortunately I threw away, and I wish I kept it. But I well remember the words that Private Davies is honorably discharged from His Majesty's Armed Forces with a record of undetected crime. So at least any of the mistakes I make tonight will be detected, so I hope you'll forgive me. So let's kick off. As I say, it's been hard acts to follow, and what I've got to say, I mean, you're all Pan-American people here, all of you, and there's not much that I can say that you don't know already, but I'll just go over a little bit of what our first lecture of the day did, and that's to cover some of the prelims. And I'm not going to dwell too long over aeroplanes like Sikorsky's and Martins and so on, but I'll just try to make a few general remarks, and then later on we can have lots of questions and perhaps arguments. So let's kick off. I believe, oh, by the way, also I've got to compliment the previous speakers on their wonderful PowerPoint displays. I'm afraid I'm of the old-fashioned kind, and I've still got 35 millimeter slides, and I hope you'll join with me in a silent prayer that they all come through the right way up. I'm going to start by pointing out something that's been observed already, and that is that this route, San Francisco to Honolulu, it's just short of 2,400 static miles, and if you can fly that route non-stop, you can fly any route in the world, except possibly if you want to fly this, and it's now being done, of course, with the longer range airplanes, but the only route longer was this one, Easter Island to Tahiti, but until a few years ago, that was not one of the world's greatest air routes. But this one, of course, is. And this was the great ambition of all the airlines. If they could have airplanes that could fly this route, then the world was their oyster. So, as has already been mentioned, there were a lot of aspirants to prove that this could be done. I'll press a button here and hope it's the right one. There we go. This one, as has already been said, was the first, I hope I'm right here, this was the first aeroplane that tried to fly from San Francisco to Hawaii, and as has been described already, it was a flying boat, and as it turned out, the emphasis was on boat, because it finished up sailing into Honolulu. Next, I believe these gentlemen are, let's see what there's. Yes, this is Maitland and Hagenberger, who actually did make it. And next, we have this famous airplane. It really is a famous airplane, and what I think it was not mentioned, you saw a picture before of the four people on board. Let's not forget that two of the people were Americans. Kingsford, Smith and Ulm were both Australian, and they were the first people ever to cross the Pacific Ocean by air. But it's often forgotten that it was a sort of joint American, Australian-American venture. And I believe some of the sponsorship with money was by Americans. So then we move on to, what have we got here? Oh yes, there's another picture. They're the four. These are two Americans. And this is presumably the greeting somewhere, probably in Brisbane. And then you've heard talk about this notorious Dole race, and you know that it really was a disaster. But let's not, before condemning the Dole race too much, let's remember that disaster was part of aviation in those days. There were lots of people killed in the Dole race, but then there were lots of other people killed especially during the 20s. Think of all the people who set off from Newfoundland to try to fly the Atlantic, we all hear about the heroes who made it by Lindbergh, who, by the way, a lot of people think he was the first person to fly across the Atlantic. He was only, I think he ranks, he was the 112th person to fly across the Atlantic. And if anybody wants to question me on that, I don't want to keep on about it now, but we all often forget that some of the two large airships crossed the Atlantic back in 1919 with a full complement of crew, and in one case with a stowaway. But Lindbergh was certainly the first man to fly the Atlantic, and he did it solo, and he also stated where he would land, which was something the other people before him couldn't be sure of, and he landed almost on time, as he'd calculated. He flew the perfect Great Circle route, 33 hours in the air, somehow or other stayed awake. It was a tremendous flight. And although we sometimes feel perhaps it's overdone, what Lindbergh did then was not only it was a wonderful achievement, but he changed the world of aviation. Suddenly, everybody thought, well, if this young man of 25 can do it, why can't we? And that applied to politicians, the public, and financiers generally. And Lindbergh was one of the factors that brought about this revolution, the absolute revolution of aviation generally, and popularity, and people wanted to fly. And all that happened at the tender age of 25. And it's very interesting that a lot of the achievements, we sometimes forget how young people were. And the previous speaker, I think, said, wanted to encourage all of us here to encourage the younger generations to take an interest in the history. And it'd be interesting to remind the younger folk that some of the magnificent achievements of the past were done by young people, not people like me with grey hair. So this was the airplane that actually won the Dole race, or one of the few airplanes that got there. It was called the Woolaroc, flown by, Art Goebel. And this is all leading up, you see, to, this is another one that's often forgotten. Clyde Pangborn, who flew from Tokyo to the United States, and he knew that he was going to have a job making it with the range and so on, and he deliberately had no landing gear on his airplane, and he crashed the airplane down in Oregon. And this, of course, is Lindbergh's Sirius, the Lockheed Sirius airplane. Now, it's interesting, and this is where I come to a little bit of background, which hasn't been mentioned before. Pan American's original thoughts on crossing to Asia were not by the route that we all know about, via Hawaii and all these islands. They were conscious all the time that airplanes did not have the range. It was this terrible 2,400-mile range from San Francisco to the nearest point of land, Hawaii, that was a big stumbling block. And for several years, they were exploring the idea of flying to Asia by the Great Circle route via Alaska and across northeastern Siberia. And in 1931, Charles Lindbergh and Anne Morrow made this flight with the Lockheed Sirius airplane. Not yet, I emphasize it wasn't yet called the Nassau-Suac. That came later when they used the same airplane to fly across the Atlantic. I just wonder whether anybody would like to guess where this picture was taken. It's a bit of a catch question. Any idea, anybody? Where? No? Alaska? No. I'll have to tell you, it was taken in Natal in South America, and I couldn't find a picture of the Sirius on the Pacific run. This was taken in 1933 when they did the circumnavigation of the Atlantic. But it's the same airplane, Sirius. Now, this is the way, the approach they were making. Pan American was trying to establish itself firmly on their projected Great Circle route across the northern rim of the Pacific Ocean. Not only was it the shorter route, but it seemed to be the safer route, because you could actually, if necessary, you could use land planes even. But they established a base in China by establishing the CNAC, the China National Aviation Corporation. They bought that from the Curtiss organization and started routes. And very successful it was too. There's a Dolphin, Douglas Dolphin flying boat, flying over the river there's the Bund, the famous Bund in Shanghai. Doesn't look like that anymore, it's all high-rise buildings. And there's the fleet of Douglas DC-2s on the ramp at Shanghai. So Pan American got themselves a pretty damn firm base in China. At the same time, they were already established in Alaska, because they formed Pacific Alaska Airways by buying the Alaskan routes from what was then American Airways. And that gave them the routes in Alaska and the base. And they also bought a little airline called Pacific Southern, which operated these airplanes. I think I can tell you what that is. I'm not an airplane man myself, but yeah, Lockheed Vega. And that was owned by Alaska Southern, a small airline that operated between Seattle and Alaska. So Pan Am sort of established themselves on the Great Circle route. But then, possibly because there were no diplomatic relations with the Soviets, and maybe for other reasons, Juan Trippe changed his mind, decided to go across the Central Atlantic. And there was one great advantage of the Central Atlantic, and that was that you could get almost all the way across to the mainland without going through any international negotiations. Because Hawaii was American, Juan Trippe, as we now know, Midway was part of the Hawaiian chain, part of the territory of Hawaii. Wake Island, he negotiated for. Guam was American. That was sort of inherited from the First World War. So, and then Manila, at that time, the Philippines was an American territory. So Pan American could virtually cross the Pacific on its own territory, on American territory, without having to negotiate difficult bilateral agreements with other countries. And in fact, to reach Hong Kong, which seemed to be the obvious terminus after Manila, the British were a bit sticky. So Trippe, being Juan Trippe, he was a marvelous card player. I wouldn't have liked to have played Trippe at poker. He flew an airplane into the neighboring Macau, which is Portuguese territory, more or less, well, he did more than hint. He said, if you don't give me the rights to come into Hong Kong, we'll simply go to Macau. We'll sign a deal with the Portuguese. And so the British gave way. And after the Clippers flew across to Manila, Sikorsky boats would make the connection to Hong Kong. And I think we'll recognize this boat, won't we? What is this? Oh, I thought you'd know that, yeah. And Sergei has already mentioned that before the China Clipper came in, the survey work had to be done to prepare the ground, and not, in addition to the bases, then the airplanes had to be, you had to prove that you could fly airplanes. So the S-40B, some of the S-42s were specially modified, and they with longer range tanks, and they were called S-42Bs, and they could actually fly that non-stop route to Hawaii. They could also fly the non-stop routes across the Atlantic. And in the case of the Pacific, I think you can correct me on this, the first survey flight was simply as far as Honolulu. The second one was as far as Midway. The third one was to Wake, and the fourth one got to Guam, and that pretty well proved that a route was possible. But unfortunately, the S-42B, if you filled it with enough gasoline to take it to Hawaii, didn't leave much room for people other than the crew. If you put people in, it was overweight, and you could not afford to not to carry enough gasoline. But I will say this, that when in 1937 the agreements were finally made, rather grudgingly, between Pan American and Juan Trippe and the British, because Juan Trippe originally wanted to fly across the Atlantic. That was his first ambition, first transoceanic ambition before the Pacific. As I say, one reason he was able to do the Pacific was because he didn't have to negotiate with the British. And the British didn't have the airplanes. Not until 1937, when they had the short S-23 flying boats, which are beautiful boats. I venture to say that aesthetically they were possibly better than the Sikorskis, aesthetically, but they weren't quite so efficient. And they were much later too. Here's an airplane that went into service in 1937, the short boats, and they were not as efficient as the S-42s that went into service in 1934. And there was an interesting story about some of these survey flights that were made. In 1937, there was a joint survey program with Pan American operating the S-42s and the British operating the specially converted S-23s, the so-called Empire flying boats. And if Sikorsky had a problem, well, the Empire flying boats, which were built, they were built for Imperial Airways to provide luxury service to the colonies, South Africa, India, Australia, and they didn't necessarily need the range. They needed comfort for all these high-level first-class passengers. Well, one very rich chap in England, when they started these survey flights, he asked if he could come along as would it be possible for him to hitch a ride on one of these British boats? And the answer came back, no, you can't. You can't, because there's no room. The airplane's overloaded with fuel, and there's no room anyway. So he wrote back and volunteered and said, look, if you'll take me, I'll sit on the floor if necessary. And the reply came back, well, we're very sorry, there's no floor. So it's very important, although this is a China Clipper celebration, I want to more or less support the Sikorsky family for having helped to start it all. So you know what this airplane is, and I'm not going to describe it. And but that is a picture, famous picture of the arrival in Manila, and you can see There she is, Ed Music and his crew arriving in Manila. What a wonderful picture that is. I think Mr. Sunderland couldn't have done better. Perhaps he did it, I don't know. But and then there's crowds all around here. It is estimated that there was several 100,000 people there to welcome Ed Music. And there is the copy of the timetable. It took quite a while to get across, took a whole week. And as Carol Nickersher has described, Pan American built luxury hotels. It was, although flying in those days, it was only the privilege of the rich and the famous and friends of one trip, it was an adventure. You flew during the day and you slept during the night, and you were just like the Imperial Airways people in Africa. They woke you up about 3 o'clock in the morning because the moment it was light, the airplanes took off and it was a long trip. So we finish up, and this is what the China Clipper was the beginning of it all. Pan American finished up by the beginning of the Second World War. They had the route across here to Manila, and also they had tried to extend the route down to Australia. The Australians, being Australians, wouldn't let them. I tell you, being British, I mean, all the flags went out recently in Britain because we won the cricket matches against Australia, who about every 4 years are not part of the Commonwealth, they're our enemies. And because of that, one trip he said, okay, we won't go to Australia, we're going to go to New Zealand. The New Zealanders were only too pleased to get an air service, and this was the experimental one in 1937, but of course that had to be cancelled because of that terrible tragedy when Ed Music in Samoa, when that airplane caught fire. So, but eventually they tried again, and then as Ed Dover has been describing, or will describe, he will describe what happened here after they established the service to New Zealand in 1940. And I won't go into detail because Ed's going to talk about that. So I'm going to end on that, but I do want to mention, I mean, all these things, I said it in the beginning, we often forget, we celebrate all the wonderful achievements, but we sometimes forget the penalties and the hardships by which the achievements were made. Let us not forget that all three of the China Clipper class, the China Clipper, the Hawaiian Clipper, and the Philippine Clipper, they all crashed, every one of them. And the other thing we've got to remember also, and it was mentioned right early on this morning, Pan American in those days was not a big airline. The total number of 4-engine flying boats that Pan American had, long-range, if you call it long-range flying boats, had to have 4 engines. You had the S-40s, the S-42s, the Martins, and the Boeings. Add them all up as one fleet. There's only 25 airplanes. 25 airplanes was the total. And I think there were never more than, I think, 18 airplanes operating simultaneously. They'd either gone out of service or, as the phrase goes, written off. And we often forget that. The Pan American was a small airline, and the S-38, which Sergei has mentioned generously, and deservedly so, it's often forgotten, this modest little S-38. How many did they have, Sergei? 38. There were twice as many S-38s in service, right at the foundation of Pan American, twice as many S-38s as the total number of all the other airplanes that Pan American had until for transocean flying. So that's a little statistic that we perhaps ought to remember. And what else was I going to say? Oh, yes, I want to go back to my, my introduction. I'm very proud of the fact that I've been associated with aviation ever since the Second World War. It was just almost by luck that I got into it, really. And I mentioned my distinguished Army career, where the worst crime was being found out. And I didn't mention the fact, another of my lifetime interests, I don't do much of it now, I'm too busy with writing books, but lifetime interests and for therapy, I've always been a great traditional jazz fan. And if anybody's interested afterwards, you can shake the hand that's shaken the hand of Louis Armstrong. And I want to end on a little bit of a little dig at Sergei here. I saw a cartoon the other day, and the cartoon was a new prototype airplane being ready for its first flight. And over on the side of the airfield, there's the designer of the airplane, and he is being dragged, kicking and screaming, to the airplane because the pilot on the initial survey flight has invited him to come along for the ride. So I hope that it's been a little bit marginal and a little bit superficial perhaps, but as I say, it's been a hard act to follow today with all these wonderful speakers, and there's some other wonderful speakers tomorrow. All I've been able to do is to more or less act as just to summarize things. But I will be happy, if I can, to answer any questions, but please don't be too aggressive. Thank you. Yes? The question is, if I can paraphrase, that did the German Dornier Wahl, a flying boat, have any influence on the development of civil aviation generally? The answer is a definite yes. The Dornier Wahl was one of the great flying boats, and then the Dornier went on to build the Super Wahl, and I forget how many hundred were built, but this was the early airplane that Germany built. Was able, after the First World War, the Great War of 1418, Germany was severely penalized for upsetting the world, and part of the penalties was that everybody knew they had some good airplanes, but the penalties was that one of the reparations, just as they had to surrender some of their great ocean liners, Germany lost all its colonies. They were not allowed to build airplanes with greater horsepower, I think, than, it was very low, 150 horsepower or something like that. And they weren't allowed to build military planes, of course, and they weren't allowed to build airplanes of greater than a certain weight. And the strange thing, it's a paradox in a way, that it acted in Germany's favor. Professor Junkers, who had been building military Junkers airplanes, the day that the war ended, he called a meeting in his factory and said, right, from now on, we're going to build commercial airplanes. And the little Junkers F-13 six-seater metal airplane. He was the first one to build airplanes with metal. Turned out to be almost a world beater. But the Germany got around the conditions of the reparations by having the airplanes built overseas. So the Dornier valves were built in Italy, and some were built in Sweden, I think. And later on, when there's that colossal Dornier Doe X, that huge airplane that could actually on short hops carry 150 people, that was built in Switzerland. So, but going back to your question, sir, or your commentary, the Dornier valve was a very much underestimated airplane, and they were following much of the same principles that Sikorsky was.
Question? Sir, do you or anybody else in this audience have any information whatsoever about whatever happened to the Martin flying boat that went to Russia?
Yes, I have. The question is, does anybody have information on the Martin flying boat that went to Russia? And I can tell you a personal story of that, because I found out what had happened, and it was my scoop, which, if I can be permitted a little commercialization, it's written up in the book that I wrote on the history of Aeroflot. When I wrote this book on Aeroflot, which was great, the book I wanted to do after quite early on, because I realized that there had never been a decent book about Aeroflot, which at the time was easily the largest airline in the world. And the Soviets, they weren't very helpful, because the job of Aeroflot was only to fly airplanes. It wasn't to provide information to historians, but they were very helpful. So I made 3 visits to the Soviet Union, flew across Siberia 3 times, and made friends and so on. And then the Aeroflot people, the pilots were wonderful. And at all the main central stations of this vast airline, it really is a vast airline. And I remember being shown around their little museum at Irkutsk, and went to Yakutsk. But when I went to Khabarovsk, they were taking me around their little museum, which is full of trophies, the sort of thing you see here, but rather more modestly, models of airplanes and pictures and medals and so on, and photographs. And the lady and the people, and by the way, there were 3 highly decorated pilots and navigators there who had flown what was known as the Russian Clipper. And we're going around this museum, and I was suddenly confronted with a photograph. And I was dumbfounded. I said, "That's the Russian Clipper." Because nobody at the time, this was back 10, 15 years ago, nobody knew what had happened to it. I said, "That's the Russian Clipper." And they all shook their heads and said, "No, no." By the way, as you may have noticed, in a lot of pictures, there's always a dog. They had a dog in this picture looking on. But I said, it's got to be, look, there's the shape of the tail and the nose and so on. I said, it's got this. No, no, no. So I said, in that case, what is it? They said very seriously, that is the Martin flying boat. They weren't going to admit to the word Clipper. And it was. And in my Aeroflot book, I took a photograph of that photograph, and I felt this is a scoop. And it was, really. And it's I put it in the Aeroflot book. So in answer to your question, sir, what happened was that Martin built this airplane, just as Sikorsky also built a big airplane, because one trip was very fond of playing one manufacturer off against another. And Martin had built this boat in the hope, and of course Boeing got the contract for the Boeing 314. So Martin was stuck with this super airplane. It was like a super China Clipper. and they sold it to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union normally did not need flying boats, because if you think the Soviet Union, as Russia today, is a huge landmass, and at that time they weren't interested in international routes, but they did have one area in the whole of the Soviet Union and Russia today where a flying boat would be very useful, and that is to cross the Sea of Okhotsk between Khabarovsk on the mainland and the island of Sakhalin across to the peninsula of Kamchatka, because hitherto they'd had used airplanes that flew the long way round, a very circuitous route. But here was an airplane that they could get, and they flew it non-stop. They did it from 1940 until about 1942. And of course, in that area, dreadful winters. And I asked these chaps, there were two pilots and a navigator. I said, what did you do in the winter? Because you couldn't use these flying boats when everything was iced up. Well, they said, we did try to fit it with skis. And I said, a huge flying boat. And they described to me what they tried to do was use the attachments for the beaching gear and fix huge skis to it. So I said, well, did it work? And they said, no. And I think in the end, the airplane was just cut up there. They needed the aluminum badly, and nobody knows exactly what happened. We believe the airplane was exported from Martin in Baltimore by ship. I think they took the wings off or something, to Taganrog in the Black Sea, where it was reassembled. And it's nobody, I could never find out, it must have been flown across the Soviet Union, possibly alighting on lakes and rivers all the way across to the far east of Siberia. But that Russian clipper did have a wonderful history. So that's a little sequel to the China clipper story. Yeah. Sir?
You alluded to the competition. Does that explain how come Pan Am went from Martin flying boat, from Sikorsky to Martin to Boeing? Was it a competition, a saber?
Well, the question is, was this a competition because Pan Am went from Sikorsky to Martin to Boeing and so on? Well, I wouldn't so much call it a competition as a sort of Machiavellian way in which Juan Trippe did things. I don't know whether Sergei could comment on that, but I think it was a close thing, wasn't it, Sergei? That, yeah.
Very close. And the Boeing 314 had a head start because the time was going on the Boeing U-15 long.
Oh, yes.
Remember Boeing Beetle?
Yes, I knew him. Yes, Sergei, just for you all, Sergei's confirmed that. And Boeing won the competition because they already had the wing from their bomber. And the designer, Wellwood Beale, was no mean designer. I met him, he came down to Douglas in his later years. And of course, in the end, Boeing had a lot of trouble with that airplane. They tried it first with, I think, one vertical stabilizer, and then with two, and they finished up, I think, with three. But it's interesting, I think Igor had a design waiting for Pan American, but Trippe being, I don't know, he made a deal with Boeing. And that's the way things were. And in those days, the manufacturers had to gamble. You couldn't take an order for 20, 30, and today 100 airplanes. In those days, you were lucky if you got an order for half a dozen. But the competition, it wasn't the kind of competition you see today. It was simply a matter of, I don't know, smoke-filled rooms. Looks as though we're... Oh, question here, sir?
Slides about 3 back showed what the prices were to fly from here to Manila. Did you get that?
Oh, yes. The question is, how much was it to fly to Manila in those days? The one-way fare from San Francisco to Manila was $800 and some odd dollars. And if you think $800 and some odd dollars then, I think it would buy you a fleet of motor cars. It was only the rich. By the way, I have seen some of the flight logs of the Clippers, and the average number of people who were on board as paying passengers from San Francisco to Honolulu, the average number was about 3. The highest number I saw in the logs was 8. And sometimes there was hardly, and half of those were friends of one trip. But as long as Pan American was being paid, they were paying, I think they were being paid $2 a mile. For every mile they flew, they got $2 mail subsidy. And so that managed to pay the crews. And the flights, as I mentioned, the fleets were small. It was only once a week, that service. Not like today. And I think $800 then would probably be something like $8,000 today. Like, you know, the Concorde fares. Sir?
I think there were some payload restrictions on the Martin Clipper from San Francisco to Honolulu. Maybe some of the pioneers can tell us, but I think they were restricted to either 8 or 10 passengers on the first leg.
Yes. The question was, or the commentary was, that Pan American was restricted to the number of passengers they could carry on the first leg. Once they got to Hawaii, they were fine. They could carry the full load. I think the Martin could carry 20 people. And the restriction, I think the actual restriction maximum was, I think it was 12, but I don't think Pan Am, if ever, carried more than 8. And Bill Maslin, who was a pilot and a navigator, and he's long gone now, but I used to know him. He was one of those pilots, and confirms that there were occasions when they would take off from San Francisco, and the navigators would be very carefully studying and watching the progress, and they would reach what was known as the point of no return, which is where the navigator and the engineer, they realize, a bit like Mr. Rogers did when he took off with not enough fuel to get to Hawaii, they realized that halfway across, let's say about 1,200 miles out of San Francisco, they just had to turn back because of the strength of the wind against them was too strong. They'd never make it. But they could make it with the wind behind them getting back to San Francisco, which they did. How are we doing? I'm sorry? I beg your pardon?
In a weight savings effort, did they ever ask passengers to take their shoes off?
I don't think they took their shoes off now. I don't think the security arrangements were quite as stiff as that. Sir?
After the war started, were some of the Martin ships devoted exclusively to the use of the Navy?
I'm sorry?
After the war started, did some of the Martin planes become devoted exclusively to the use of the Navy?
All right. The question is, did the Martin boats, were they devoted exclusively to the use of the U.S. Navy? Well, one of the Martin boats, the Hawaii Clipper, went down to the east somewhere between Guam and Wake before the United States came into the war. The Philippine Clipper was being used by, I think, the Navy, and yeah, almost certainly, and it was doing flights, I suppose supply flights from Hawaii to the mainland, and a high-ranking group, no names, no pack drill, they say, and I forget the names anyway, but they wanted to go back to a meeting in San Francisco or to the mainland. And although the meteorological people and the crew didn't want to do it because the forecasts were bad, they were forced to go, and the Philippine Clipper went into the mountains north of here. And the third airplane was the China Clipper itself, was used, very interestingly, on a route across the South Atlantic to what was then called the Belgian Congo and is now Zaire, which happened to be one of the world's sources of uranium. And you know what that's used for. And the China Clipper was used on a supply route to the city. It's now called Kinshasa. They went to Leopoldville. And I'm not sure whether what they brought back with them, because it's possible they were bringing back some uranium ore or something. But anyway, it crashed on takeoff from Port of Spain in Trinidad. And that was the end of the China Clipper. Yeah, well, I didn't know. Yes, the gentleman says it only did a couple of trips before it crashed. No. So we often forget that those were the 1920s, even the 30s. These were perilous times. You couldn't blame it on anybody particularly, neither the manufacturers, the airlines, or the pilots. It was just to achieve the technological progress that's been made within our lifetime, really. It was extremely difficult, extremely dangerous, and at times heroic.
Question?
Well,
Last question.
What was one trip participation in the development of the 747?
the question is, what was Juan Tripp's part in the development of the 747? Well, that would be the subject of another lecture, but I'll try. Juan Tripp, during the early history of Pan American, and I believe quite rightly so, and it's as true today as it was then, the next generation of airplanes has got to be bigger than the last one. Otherwise, the airports can't cope with the frequencies and so on. And you see it today with the big Airbus coming in next year. But Juan Tripp wanted an airplane that was a lot bigger than the 707 and DC-8. And he knew what he wanted. He wanted, in fact, at that time, world air traffic was growing at 15% per year. That means it pretty well doubles every 5 years. You had to have either lots more airplanes, small airplanes, or if you wanted to cope with the increase in traffic, you had big airplanes. So Juan Tripp, he was very crafty. He forced the issue a bit. He ordered engines first, and then finally shook hands with Bill Allen at Boeing, and they made a deal. And he really ordered too many. He ordered 25 airplanes, and he should have later on when, what's his name? The pilot who became... No, before Hallaby. Yeah, Harold Gray, who was chief pilot, he became president. He had the opportunity of reducing the order from 25 airplanes down to 17 and leasing the rest of them so that the Pan Am could pay as you go, but he didn't. But it was, of course, a magnificent airplane, and still is. It entered service in Pan Am in 1970, and it is still a flag carrier today. Many of Japan Airlines are still operating 90 747s, and it'd be interesting we talk about history as being of the past. We're living through history now, especially in technological development, because you've got Boeing, which is promoting the 787, which is 50% composite built. But it's only about 240 seats, which means Boeing are promoted, they're basing their forecasts on having lots more airplanes. To replace, I can't see Japan Airlines replacing their 400-seat 747s with 200-seat 787s, whereas Airbus is doing the 380, which even with mixed-class seating has 555 seats. And with full economy, you can put about 800 in, and that's going to be the answer. But, you know, the 747 really was a Pan-American airplane, and subsequently Boeing finished up by building more than 1,000 of them. And just how instinctively fortuitous, well, not fortuitous, instinctively correct he was. You know, Pan American at that time, it's the only airline in the world that I've ever described in my writings and lectures as the world's only mega carrier. It was an airline that set the stage, it set the standards. And I talked to the president of Air France once when I was trying to sell airplanes from Douglas. And I said, you know, what happened, you know, what was the result of your technical evaluation of the 747 and against Douglas or Lockheed, and what about the financing, and what about the product support and all that stuff? Oh, he said, we didn't do any of that. He said, the moment we heard that Pan American had ordered the 747, I sent 2 contract people over to Boeing to just take 2 airplanes straight away without any analysis. Pan American was doing all the analysis for the rest of the world. Okay?
Ron, thank you once again for your scholarly insights. It's wonderful to have you with us today. That concludes our series of lectures for today. I want to mention that we do have a number of Ron's books, not all 22 or 23, but more than I could carry up here in my arms. And he is graciously, I believe, willing to sign a few books out front if anybody's interested in that.